What happens when a man loses everything, his best friend, his sense of justice, and his faith in the system? What happens when a former Delta Force operative decides enough is enough? When the law fails, can one man's vengeance bring true justice? The fight for accountability, power, and revenge begins now. Will he succeed? Stay tuned and find out. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Marcus King, a former Delta Force operative, had spent the last few months overseas on a high-stakes security assignment. Now back home in Phoenix, Arizona, all he wanted was a peaceful afternoon with his loyal Rottweiler, Titan. The sun was high, the sky clear, and everything felt quiet, exactly the way Marcus had imagined his return to be. After all the chaos of war zones, high-risk missions, and constant danger, a simple walk with his dog was all he needed to feel grounded again. Titan trotted beside him, calm and obedient. The dog's presence was a comforting reminder of Marcus's years of service. They had been through thick and thin together, and now they were home. Home was supposed to be safe. Home was supposed to be where Marcus could relax and not worry about threats lurking behind every corner. Yet, Marcus's instincts never truly rested. Even in the peace of suburbia, years of military training had him scanning his surroundings. He couldn't help but notice the slight pauses in the actions of people around him. A car slowed down as it approached an intersection. A curtain flickered in an upstairs window, and a jogger slowed, just a bit too much when passing by. It was nothing overt, nothing alarming, but his gut told him something was off. That's when he saw the police cruiser rounding the corner ahead. The black and white vehicle with the familiar shape of the officers inside was a sight Marcus knew all too well. But this time, the presence of law enforcement felt different. The car crept closer to him, slowing down as it pulled alongside him and Titan. A voice broke the quiet, coming from the officer behind the wheel. "Afternoon, sir," Officer Lawson said, his tone too casual for the situation. Marcus stopped walking and turned toward the officer, maintaining his calm. "Afternoon, officer," he replied politely, giving the officer no reason to escalate things. Officer Lawson eyed him for a moment, sizing him up. Officer Jenkins, the second officer, had already stepped out of the vehicle, standing slightly behind Lawson. Jenkins didn't speak, but positioned himself just far enough to make Marcus feel uneasy, a subtle attempt to assert dominance. It was clear these officers weren't here for a friendly chat. "Do you live around here?" Lawson asked, his voice calm but probing. "Yes, sir," Marcus answered, keeping his voice steady. "I live down the street," Lawson smirked slightly. "Funny, I don't think I've seen you around before," he said. "Where you from?" Marcus didn't flinch. He had dealt with questions like this before. "I travel a lot for work." "Just got back from overseas," he said. He didn't elaborate, knowing full well that a simple answer would suffice. Jenkins scoffed under his breath, seemingly dismissive of Marcus's explanation. "Security consulting, huh? Fancy way of saying mercenary," he said sarcastically. Marcus wasn't bothered. Let them think whatever they wanted. "Not quite," he replied with a small, polite smile. "Private security. I train teams for high-risk environments." Lawson nodded, his expression unreadable. But Marcus could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change in the officer's demeanor. The casual questioning had taken on a more suspicious tone. "We got a call about someone acting suspicious in the neighborhood," Lawson continued, his tone now less friendly. "Thought we'd check it out." Marcus raised an eyebrow but kept his voice level. "I didn't realize walking my dog was suspicious." Lawson smirked again, his eyes flicking to Titan, who was standing quietly but alert. "You'd be surprised what people think is suspicious these days," he said, his voice laced with mockery. Jenkins leaned in slightly, eyeing Titan. "That's a big dog," he remarked, his voice feigning interest. "He's trained," Marcus said simply, glancing at Titan. The dog stood tall, his alert eyes fixed on the officers. Jenkins took a step closer, his eyes scanning Titan. "Trained for what?" he asked, as if testing Marcus. "Obedience," Marcus replied calmly, trying to keep the situation from escalating. "Protection. He's disciplined." Jenkins nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Trained to attack?" he asked, his tone now sharper. "No," Marcus said firmly. "Trained to defend." For a moment, there was a silence between them. Lawson's eyes shifted toward his partner, and the tension in the air became thick. It was becoming clear that they weren't simply questioning Marcus out of curiosity. "You're going to need to show some ID," Lawson said, his voice flat, no longer pretending to be friendly. Marcus knew his rights. He could refuse. But he also knew that refusing could provoke them, make things worse. He slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, offering it to Lawson without a hint of hesitation. Lawson barely glanced at the ID before waving it away dismissively. "I think we're going to need you to step over here for a second," he said, his tone shifting from casual to commanding. Marcus felt his patience thinning, but he stayed calm. He gave Titan's leash a light tug. The dog responded immediately, standing at attention. Marcus kept his movements deliberate, measured. Titan's body language shifted slightly, a barely noticeable change that only Marcus would catch. The dog had sensed something was wrong, and it was becoming clear to Marcus that the officers were escalating the situation. "I've cooperated," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I've shown you my ID. There's no reason to detain me." Jenkins took a step forward, his body tense. "Something about you doesn't sit right with me," he muttered, his voice dripping with suspicion. "I don't know," Lawson said, folding his arms, his stance becoming more aggressive. "I think we need to ask a few more questions." Marcus stood still, weighing his options. He could feel the pressure building. He was a trained professional, someone who had spent years in the most dangerous environments imaginable, but the situation was different now. This wasn't a battlefield. This was supposed to be his home. He had nothing to hide, but they were determined to push. Titan was still standing beside him, his body tense. Marcus knew his dog. Titan wasn't just protecting him. He was picking up on the same tension Marcus felt in the air. The officers weren't about to back down, and that was when it happened. Jenkins moved forward, reaching for Marcus's wrist with a swift motion. Titan reacted instantly, his deep growl vibrating through the air. Before Marcus could stop it, Jenkins's hand was on his weapon, his fingers twitching toward his holster. "Get that dog back," Lawson barked, his voice sharp with aggression. Marcus acted without thinking. His training took over. He quickly shifted, using his arm to redirect Jenkins's grip away from him, stepping back even as he kept a firm hold on Titan's leash. The dog stood his ground, his muscles coiled, ready to defend his owner. "Easy, Titan," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. He knew his dog would listen, but the situation had already spiraled beyond his control. Jenkins had drawn his gun. Lawson's hand hovered near his own holster. It was happening. Everything Marcus had feared was about to unfold. Marcus King sat in the stillness of his living room, his eyes fixed on the space where Titan had once lay, his faithful companion, the dog who had been by his side through years of operations and missions. The silence was deafening, an oppressive weight that felt as if the entire world had come crashing down around him. The grief was raw, more intense than he had anticipated, and for a moment, it felt like he couldn't breathe. He had seen death up close many times. He had been the one to take lives, and he had witnessed the loss of others. But this was different. This wasn't some nameless enemy, some faceless figure in the heat of battle. This was Titan, the one being who had stood by him through every hardship, every danger, and every moment of darkness. His mind replayed the moment over and over again. The sound of the gunshot, the way Titan's body jerked back, the look of pain and confusion in his eyes as he collapsed at Marcus's feet. The image burned into his mind, unshakable and relentless. He could still feel the warmth of Titan's blood staining his hands, still hear the low, pained whimpers of his dog as his life slipped away. Marcus clenched his fists, the rage building in his chest like an inferno. He had always prided himself on keeping his emotions in check. But this was different. This was personal. It wasn't just about losing a dog. It wasn't just about the betrayal of the officers, Lawson and Jenkins. It was about the injustice, the senseless violence that had taken something irreplaceable from him. His life had always been about control, precision, and calculated moves. He had been trained to keep a clear mind in the chaos, to focus on the mission at hand. But now, all that focus, all that training was directed toward one singular goal: revenge. Marcus couldn't afford to let grief cloud his judgment. He knew the stakes were too high and he couldn't risk making a mistake. He needed a plan, a methodical, strategic plan to make Lawson and Jenkins pay for what they had done. This wasn't going to be some spur-of-the-moment retaliation. It would be calculated. It would be precise. He knew better than anyone how to use the system to his advantage, and now he would turn those same tactics against the officers who had killed Titan. His first step was to gather information. Lawson and Jenkins weren't just random officers who had made a mistake. No, they had a history, a pattern of behavior that Marcus could exploit. He started researching their pasts, looking for any instances of misconduct, corruption, or violence. It didn't take long to find evidence of their abusive tendencies: unlawful arrests, excessive force complaints, accusations of brutality that had been buried under layers of bureaucracy. Marcus knew the system all too well. He knew how these officers operated with impunity, how they used their badges as shields to hide behind, thinking they were untouchable. But Marcus also knew that no one was truly untouchable. Everyone had a weakness. Everyone had something they were hiding, and it was Marcus's job to find it. With each passing day, Marcus dug deeper into the officers' histories. He gathered public records, scoured social media profiles, and even talked to people in the neighborhood who had interacted with them. It wasn't hard to find the cracks in their facades. Lawson, with his charming smile and smooth words, had a long history of harassing people of color, using his authority to intimidate and dominate. Jenkins, the more volatile of the two, had a reputation for being hot-headed and prone to violence. Together, they made the perfect storm, a pair of corrupt officers who had made a career out of abusing their power. Marcus knew he couldn't go after them directly, not yet. He needed to build a case, gather solid evidence that would bring them down. The key was to expose them, to show the world the true nature of these officers and the corruption that ran deep within the police force. Marcus wasn't interested in just getting revenge. He wanted justice. He wanted to make sure that no one else would have to suffer at their hands. To that end, Marcus began collecting video footage from local businesses, surveillance cameras, and even bystanders who had witnessed the officers in action. He spent hours reviewing body camera footage from previous arrests, looking for signs of misconduct, any proof that could tie Lawson and Jenkins to their history of violence. He wasn't just gathering random pieces of evidence. He was building a narrative. He was laying the groundwork for the inevitable confrontation. He also began reaching out to people who had been affected by the officers' actions. One of the most powerful tools in his arsenal was the testimonies of people who had suffered because of Lawson and Jenkins. Marcus had the connections and the skills to make people talk, to get them to open up about the injustices they had experienced. He wasn't going to do it the easy way. He wasn't going to rely on a slap on the wrist or a quick fix. This was about taking down two men who had used their badges to wreak havoc on the community. And he was going to make sure they paid for every one of their crimes. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus's resolve only hardened. He kept his head down in public, acting as though nothing had changed, but in the quiet of his home, he worked tirelessly to expose the corruption that had taken his dog's life. His nights were filled with planning, analyzing every detail, every step. His training as a Delta Force operative had given him a razor-sharp focus, the ability to see the big picture while paying attention to the smallest details. He knew that in this fight, the smallest mistake could be the difference between success and failure. But it wasn't just about strategy and evidence. Marcus had a deep, personal need to make Lawson and Jenkins feel the consequences of their actions. It wasn't just about putting them behind bars. It was about showing them that they couldn't get away with murder, that they couldn't simply use their badges to shield themselves from the world. He wanted them to understand what it felt like to lose something precious. He wanted them to experience the emptiness, the rage, the helplessness he had felt when he cradled Titan in his arms, watching his dog breathe his last breath. His plan began to take shape. Every piece of evidence he gathered, every witness he interviewed, brought him one step closer to his goal. It wasn't going to be easy. Marcus knew that the police force would do everything in its power to protect its own. But he also knew that the truth, once it was out in the open, could never be silenced. And he was willing to do whatever it took to make sure that the officers who had killed Titan would face the consequences of their actions. Marcus wasn't just fighting for revenge anymore. He was fighting for justice, not just for Titan, but for every person who had ever been a victim of police brutality, for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. He wasn't going to stop until Lawson and Jenkins were held accountable, and he knew that when the time came, he would be ready to strike. Marcus King had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The evidence was gathered, meticulously compiled, and ready to be exposed. He had collected everything, from video footage to testimonies, from public records to anonymous tips, pieces of a dark puzzle that painted a clear picture of the corruption within the police force. And at the center of it all were officers Lawson and Jenkins, two men who had used their badges to wield power over the innocent, two men who believed their positions of authority made them untouchable. But Marcus wasn't going to let them get away with it. No, he wasn't about to sit idly by and let the system protect them. He knew that if he wanted justice for Titan and for every other victim they had abused, he had to expose the truth. And Marcus wasn't afraid to fight back, even if it meant taking on the very system that was supposed to protect him. He had spent long nights going over the evidence, ensuring everything was watertight. Every video clip, every witness statement, every scrap of documentation was precisely what he needed to bring these men down. There was no room for error. Marcus had seen firsthand how powerful people could manipulate the system, how they could bury the truth under layers of red tape. But Marcus wasn't some random citizen. He was a former Delta Force operative with the skills, connections, and determination to make sure this wouldn't be swept under the rug. It was time to go public. Marcus had already prepared a statement, a carefully crafted message that would capture the attention of human rights organizations, journalists, and the general public. He wasn't just revealing the corruption of Lawson and Jenkins. He was making a statement about accountability, about justice, and about the power of the people to hold those in power accountable. He wasn't going to allow the officers to continue hiding behind their badges and shields of authority. With a steady hand, Marcus clicked send. The email containing all the incriminating evidence was sent to human rights organizations, journalists, and activists who had been fighting for justice within the community for years. He included video footage of Lawson and Jenkins using excessive force, unlawful arrests, and racial profiling. The testimonies of their victims were attached, detailing the abuse and violence they had suffered at the hands of these officers. Everything was there, laid out for the world to see. The press release he had prepared went out almost immediately, carried by reporters eager to break the story. They had been waiting for something like this, a story that would shake the very foundations of the police department. The moment the first journalist picked up the story, the news spread like wildfire. Headlines exploded across social media, with people sharing the videos, the reports, the testimony. The community, which had been so accustomed to seeing Lawson and Jenkins as untouchable figures, now had to confront the ugly truth about them. But Marcus didn't stop there. He knew that, for these officers to truly face consequences, they needed to be held accountable within the department. So, he took the final step. He reported everything to the Internal Affairs Division of the police department. He knew that would start an official investigation, but he also knew that this would be the hardest part of the process. Internal affairs was part of the system, and it wasn't always easy to get justice from within the very organization that was supposed to be policing itself. Still, Marcus wasn't worried. The truth was on his side, and there was no way they could hide it now. The investigation began, and soon, Lawson and Jenkins found themselves under a microscope. Their every move, every decision, every action was now under scrutiny, and they couldn't escape it. The walls they had built around themselves, the lies they had told to protect their own, were starting to crumble. There was nowhere left for them to hide. For the first time in their careers, the two officers were forced to face the consequences of their actions. They had always believed they were untouchable, that their badges and the power they wielded would protect them from any real accountability. But now, they were being exposed, and they had no idea how to stop it. Lawson's calm, smug demeanor began to crack, and Jenkins's volatile temper flared as their investigation unfolded. The public pressure mounted, and soon, their past misdeeds were impossible to deny. The media, now fully invested in the story, began digging into their pasts. Reports flooded in, detailing their previous offenses, cases of excessive force, false arrests, and blatant disregard for civil rights. Victims from years ago came forward, and what had once been isolated incidents were now part of a broader, deeply troubling pattern of abuse. The community, which had once feared these officers, now began to rally around Marcus. People took to the streets, joining protests and demanding accountability from the police. The hashtag Justice for Titan spread like wildfire, and soon it wasn't just about Marcus and Titan. It was about every person who had been oppressed, harassed, or wronged by the very people who were supposed to protect them. But it wasn't just the public that was paying attention. Within the police department, things began to shift. As the investigation into Lawson and Jenkins grew, whispers spread about how deeply rooted corruption ran in the force. Marcus's actions were starting to bring about something bigger, a reckoning that extended beyond just these two officers. The community was now united in the belief that the police force needed to change, that it could no longer operate with impunity. For Marcus, this was only the beginning. Exposing the corruption of Lawson and Jenkins was only part of his plan. He knew that if he truly wanted to change the system, he had to keep pushing, keep exposing the lies, and keep fighting for justice. The stakes were higher now. He had no choice but to see this through to the end, no matter what it took. As the investigation into Lawson and Jenkins continued, Marcus's resolve only grew stronger. The officer's downfall was inevitable. The truth had been exposed, and there was no turning back. But even as they were forced to face the consequences of their actions, Marcus knew that the fight for justice wasn't over. It had only just begun. The courtroom was silent. The tension in the air was palpable as the judge read aloud the sentences. Lawson and Jenkins sat at the defendant's table, their faces a mixture of disbelief and resignation. For years, they had used their badges as shields, believing they were above reproach. They had never imagined that the day would come when they would have to answer for their crimes, when the system they so easily manipulated would turn against them. But here they were, at the mercy of the very people they had abused, with nowhere left to hide. The judge's voice echoed in Marcus's ears as he stood in the back of the courtroom, his eyes focused on the two officers who had once been so untouchable. For the abuse of power, excessive force, and the murder of an innocent animal, the judge continued, I hereby sentence Officers Gregory Lawson and Anthony Jenkins to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. Marcus didn't feel any triumph as the words rang out. He had spent so long waiting for this moment, but now that it had arrived, he couldn't shake the sense of emptiness that lingered in his chest. Titan was gone. The justice that had been served was important, but it could never replace what he had lost. Lawson and Jenkins were going to prison, but that didn't bring Titan back. The grief that had once consumed him was still there, like a heavy weight pressing on his heart, only now it was mixed with a sense of hollow satisfaction. The scales of justice had tipped in his favor, but the cost had been steep. The officers, shackled and escorted out of the courtroom by armed guards, looked less like powerful enforcers of the law and more like two broken men. Their arrogance had melted away, replaced by the grim reality that their lives were ruined. Marcus could see the fear in their eyes as they were led away. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey, their world crumbling around them. But Marcus didn't focus on them for long. His thoughts were with Titan, his loyal dog, his protector, his friend. Titan had been his constant companion, always by his side, providing comfort and strength when Marcus needed it most. And now, Titan was gone, taken from him by the very people who were supposed to protect and serve. The justice that had been served today didn't erase the pain of that loss. As the courtroom doors closed behind Lawson and Jenkins, Marcus turned and walked out. He didn't need to hear the reporters' questions or see the cameras flashing. He didn't need to be part of the media circus that had surrounded this case from the beginning. He had gotten what he wanted. He had exposed the truth, he had brought Lawson and Jenkins to justice, and now he could move on. At least, that was what he told himself. He drove home in silence, the weight of the day settling over him like a thick fog. His car moved slowly through the streets of Phoenix, but he didn't really notice the passing scenery. He was thinking of Titan, of the bond they had shared, and of everything that had led up to this point. The anger that had driven him for so long had dulled, replaced by something else, something deeper, more painful. He had won, but the victory felt incomplete. When he arrived home, Marcus didn't immediately go inside. He knew what he needed to do. He grabbed a small bag from the back seat, the one he had kept with him for weeks now, and walked to the backyard. There, beneath the shade of a large oak tree, was Titan's grave. The simple stone marker was all that remained of the dog who had been his family, his companion, and his strength. Marcus knelt beside the grave, his fingers brushing over the earth where Titan was buried. He had done what he set out to do. Lawson and Jenkins were gone, their power stripped away. But as he sat there in the quiet of the evening, he knew it wasn't enough. Justice had been served, but the hole in his heart remained. Titan's absence would always be with him, a constant reminder of what he had lost and the price he had paid to get here. A soft breeze stirred the air, rustling the leaves above him. Marcus closed his eyes and let the sound of nature wash over him. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to remember the good times with Titan, the long walks, the companionship, The way his dog's eyes had always seemed to understand him without the need for words. Those memories would be all he had left, and he would hold onto them tightly. But even as the grief weighed heavily on him, Marcus knew that the fight was far from over. The victory in court was just one battle in a much larger war. Lawson and Jenkins were only the tip of the iceberg. The corruption within the police force, the abuse of power, and the systemic issues that allowed officers like them to operate with impunity were still very much alive. Marcus had made a difference today, but he knew that real change would take time, and he wasn't about to stop until that change came. As he sat there, the sounds of the world continuing around him, Marcus made a silent promise to Titan. He wouldn't let this be the end. He wouldn't let the system return to its old ways. The fight for justice, for equality, for accountability, he would continue it, no matter what it took. Titan's death would not be in vain. Marcus stood up, his hand still resting on the stone that marked his dog's grave. He took one last look at the spot, the place where Titan would remain forever, and then he turned and walked back inside. The grief would always be there, but he had work to do. The next battle awaited, and Marcus was ready for it. As he closed the door behind him, he felt a sense of quiet resolve settle in his chest. The fight for justice had just begun, and Marcus King would be at the forefront of it, every step of the way. Marcus King stood at the edge of Titan's grave, the weight of everything that had transpired in the last few weeks heavy on his shoulders. The court had done its job. Lawson and Jenkins had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, a punishment that seemed fitting for the officers who had used their badges as a shield to hide behind for far too long. But for Marcus, the sentencing was only one part of the larger picture. He had avenged Titan. He had exposed the corruption, but the real work wasn't over. It had only just begun. He looked down at the freshly marked stone, the simple engraving reading, "Titan, loyal to the end." The tears he had shed for his dog still stung in his eyes. The pain of losing his companion, his protector, would never truly leave him. But as he stood there in the quiet solitude of the afternoon, he knew that his fight hadn't just been about revenge. It had been about something much bigger. Justice. Justice wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't something you could just demand and expect to receive. It was something you had to fight for, relentlessly and without hesitation. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the personal cost. And Marcus had learned that lesson the hard way. Titan's death had ignited a fire within him that could never be extinguished. But that fire had burned away the fear, the doubt, the belief that the system was untouchable. The truth, as painful and heartbreaking as it was, had set him on a path to fight for justice not only for his dog, but for everyone who had been silenced by the system. With Lawson and Jenkins now behind bars, Marcus knew it wasn't enough. The victory in court was important, but it was only a small piece of the larger battle. The police force, the very institution that had allowed these officers to wreak havoc, still had much to answer for. Marcus knew that if he wanted to truly bring about change, he had to keep pushing. He couldn't afford to rest. The fight for accountability, for transparency, and for justice had to continue. Marcus spent the weeks following the trial working tirelessly to ensure that Lawson and Jenkins would never again have the power to abuse their positions. The ripple effect of their convictions had begun, but Marcus was determined to make sure it didn't stop there. He worked closely with human rights organizations, activists, and legal experts to continue pushing for reform within the police force. He met with lawmakers, shared his story, and advocated for real change. The corruption that had existed for far too long in the system needed to be rooted out. And Marcus was ready to be the one to lead that charge. Every conversation he had, every meeting he attended, every speech he gave, was driven by the same purpose: to ensure that the power Lawson and Jenkins had once wielded was never again allowed to go unchecked. He pushed for a complete overhaul of the way police officers were trained, how they were held accountable, and how complaints of abuse were handled. He worked to implement community oversight of police departments, pushing for systems that would hold officers accountable before they could cause more harm. Marcus knew that change was a long, slow process, but he wasn't going to stop. The public had rallied behind Marcus in ways he never could have predicted. The media attention that had followed the trial hadn't faded. People were talking about what had happened. They were questioning the system, questioning the authority of the police. They were demanding better, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. Social media campaigns, protests, and public demonstrations began to spread across the country. The hashtag Justice for Titan had turned into a symbol of the fight for justice, and Marcus had become its face. But as the movement grew, so did the resistance. There were those who didn't want the system to change, those who were comfortable with the way things were, those who believed that the status quo was enough. They fought back, trying to discredit Marcus, trying to silence his message, but he wasn't going to back down. It was hard at times. There were moments when Marcus wondered if all this work, all this effort would actually make a difference. He had lost so much. His best friend, his dog, was gone. His faith in the system had been shattered. But in his heart, he knew that there was no turning back. He couldn't stop now, not when so many people were counting on him. One morning, months after the trial had ended, Marcus stood at the front of a packed auditorium, addressing a crowd of law enforcement officials, community leaders, and activists. The room was full, and there was an air of anticipation. Marcus had become a symbol of the fight for justice. His story had resonated with so many, and now he was using his voice to push for real change. As he stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He took a deep breath and looked out at the crowd, remembering the journey that had brought him here. "This is not the end," he said, his voice strong and steady. "This is just the beginning. We've taken the first step, but there is so much more to do. We can't let the system continue to protect those who abuse their power. We have to hold those in authority accountable, no matter who they are, no matter how powerful they think they are. The fight for justice doesn't end when the trial is over. It doesn't end when the sentences are handed down. It only ends when the system is fixed, and that, my friends, is what we're going to do, together." The room erupted in applause. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't feel the need to. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But as he stood there in front of all those people who believed in the cause, he felt a sense of pride. He had avenged Titan. He had brought justice to those who had been wronged. But more importantly, he had started a movement. He had shown the world that no one, no matter how powerful, could escape responsibility for their actions. Marcus wasn't done yet. The fight was far from over. But with every step he took, with every victory he claimed, he was getting closer to the change that was so desperately needed. And as long as there was breath in his body, as long as there was fight left in him, he would keep pushing. For Titan, for the victims, for justice. Because in the end, justice would always prevail.